guyyaa Oromiyaa hundee jiruutiyaa si barbaadaan deemaa halkanii fi guyyaa.
Daawwattoota keenya attam jirtu. Kun Oromiyaa TV dha. Oromiyaa TV'n sagantaa adda addaa Oromiffaadhaan qopheessee isinii dhiyeessa.
Jiru tanarratti hidhamee tumamee jiru tanarratti hidhamee tumamee maqaa alagaatti ol godhee waamamee illimaa jiruuti kunoo sakaalamee jiraachuun koo malee Oromiyaa malee Oromiyaa malee.
Daawwattoota keenya har'a istuudiyoo Oromiyaa TV keessatti keessummaa jabaa tokko qabna. Keessummaan keenyas Dr. Trevor Truman kan jedhamudha. Baay'een keessanii akkuma beektani Dr. Trevor Truman kan gita gargaarsa Oromoo yookaas Oromoo Support Groupii kan jalqabe akkasumas immoo dura taa'aa isaati. Dr. Trevor Truman waggaa dheeraadhaa fi waa'ee miidhaa uummata Oromoo irra ga'aa jiru saaxila baasuudhaaf uummata addunyaa duratti beeksisuudhaaf hojii guddaa waggaa dheeraadhaaf hojjechaa jira. Ammas ittuma fufee jira. Kanaaf baay'een keessan Dr. Trevor Truman akkasiin beektanii nan abdadha. Akkasumas barruu isaanii baasan tokko hin jira sagalee haaraa kan jedhamu hedduun keessanii kana akkasiin agartanii dubbiftan nan abdadha. Kanaan dura sagalee haaraan kuni hin gurgurama. Subscribe gochuu barbaachisa. Namoonni baay'een naannaa Minneapolis fi St. Paul namoonni subscribe godhan baay'eetu jiru. Haa ta'u malee Oromoonni kana baay'isanii bitachuun barbaachisaadha. Kuni waan miidhaa uummata keenyarra gahu waan baay'een achirratti ba'a. Namoonni hidhaman, namoonni ajjeefaman, namoonni lafa isaan bu'an dhabame maqaan isaanii yeroo baay'ee achirratti ba'a. Kanaafuu waan baay'ee achirraa argachuu odeessii baay'ee achirraa argachuu hin dandeenya. Kanayyuu malee immoo yoo waan kana binnee dubbifne sagalee haaraa yoo binnee dubbifne dhaaba kanaafis gargaarsa ta'a jechuudha. Dhaabi kun namoota alagaatu geggeessaa jira. Dr. Truman fi Sue Pollock isaan lamaantu geggeessaa. Kanaafuu yeroo warri alagaadhaan nu gargaaruu barbaadan immoo caalaatti isaan jajjabeessinee karaa horiitiinis karaa mooraaliitiinis ta'ee jajjabeessuu waan nurra jiruu fi kanaafuu sagalee haaraa warri kanaan dura bitachaa turtanis akka itti fuftan hin abdannaa. Warri immoo kanaan dura hin jalqabin amma jalqabdanii waan kana bitattanii akkasin dubbiftan isin kadhannaa. Egaan akkuma isinuu beektanii Dr. Truman afaan Oromoo waan hin beekneef sagantaan keenya har'aa afaan Ingiliziitiin ta'a. Egaan akka nu dhaggeeffattaniif isin affeerra. Today we are more than fortunate to have in our studio Dr. Trevor Truman. Dr. Truman is a founder and chairman of Oromo Support Group based in London. A true friend of the Oromo people, Dr. Truman works tirelessly to expose the gross human rights violation in Oromia by the Ethiopian government. A medical doctor by profession, he spends most of his time campaigning for the release of thousands of Oromo political prisoners and the protection of human rights in that region. Now, without much ado, let me present to you Dr. Trevor Truman. Dr. Truman, welcome.
Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to thank you for coming with such a short notice.
It's a great pleasure to be here as always amongst the Oromoo community in Minneapolis. Thank you.
First, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first became involved with the Oromo issue?
I first was acquainted with the Oromo issue in 1988 when I began working with a small British non-governmental organisation training health workers in refugee populations of Oromo in Sudan. And then as the then communist military regime got weaker, we were able to do some training of village health workers over the border in Sudan, actually in Waggaa province. And we were able to mount a vaccination campaign against meningitis. So I was able to spend some time walking amongst Oromo villages and speaking with people there. So as I got to know the Oromo people more and more, then when things changed in 1991, especially after 1992, I became increasingly concerned and angry with what was happening to the Oromo people and the silence of the international community in Britain and the US. There was not a squeak of protest. And when an Oromo friend of mine in London suggested that a few of us who had worked amongst the Oromo people got together and started to agitate or raise awareness of the issue of the Oromo, then I was more than willing to partake.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell us about the Oromo support group? When
Yeah,
it was
we
started, why it was started, what it's doing right now?
Well, as I said, because there seemed to be nobody listening to the Oromo friends we had when they were complaining of human rights abuses and the real nature of the regime in Ethiopia. An Oromo friend in London in 1994 suggested that we start organising a group to raise awareness of the issues. And since then we've been publishing a newsletter, Sagalehara, New Voice, and press releases every 2 months which catalogue human rights abuses against Oromo and other people in Ethiopia. And that has become the main function of the group. It's to try to record accurate, solid facts about human rights abuses in Ethiopia.
What is the current human rights situation in Ethiopia? Is it improving, deteriorating? What's happening right now?
It's certainly not improving. It's more difficult now to get information out of Ethiopia because of the repressive nature of the regime and the increasing stranglehold it has over people there. We still get some information from brave people inside the country who, at some risk to themselves, are sending us information. Also, we get a lot of information from Oromo who are fleeing human rights abuses in Ethiopia and have taken refuge in neighbouring countries, Sudan, Kenya and Djibouti. And what we hear and what we see openly admitted by the government there is that there's an increasing crackdown on Oromo intellectuals, human rights defenders, journalists and even prominent Oromo within the business community. And this is under the cloak of a crackdown on terrorism, which seems to have unfortunately gained some credibility with the Western media. But you certainly cannot say that this regime is any better than any of the previous regimes in terms of abuses against the Oromo. In fact, in many ways it is much worse than any of the previous regimes. For example, not even the Derg would pursue prominent Oromo who had sought refuge in Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti. But this regime is doing that. This regime is killing, disappearing and detaining people just because they're prominent Oromo figures. They're not necessarily politically active. And it seems that this is the first regime to target the Oromo with such precision. The previous regimes have been oppressive, sure, and they've committed abuses against all of the peoples of Ethiopia. But this regime seems to be particularly targeting the Oromo.
Yeah, there was a recent report that there has been a mass arrest of Oromos that...
Yeah, over the last 8 months or so, we've seen waves of arrests, increasingly so in the capital now. Previously, the regime tried to do all its dirty work in the countryside, away from the spotlight of the international media, away from the BBC and newspaper stringers in Addis Ababa, and away from the diplomats. But now we're seeing killings in the street of Addis Ababa by uniformed armed security personnel of unarmed civilians, and they say, oh, these were terrorists.
Okay, the success of the Oromo support group, are you, do you think the Western governments and the American governments, do they listen to what you are telling them? Do you see some...
they certainly show no signs of listening to us, but the awareness of the nature of that regime in Ethiopia is changing. For example, in 1992, 1993, 1994, if you read a newspaper article about Ethiopia, it was all the same message: what a wonderful government is, how they've helped all the various peoples of Ethiopia to express themselves, how democratic they are, everybody's being involved in government and all this sort of stuff. But now, if you read any article in the serious media regarding Africa or in the general press, you will see any mention of Ethiopia is bracketed with information about human rights abuses there. So I don't know how much the Oromia support group has been part of that raising awareness, but there certainly is an awareness of the extent of human rights abuses now in Ethiopia. Not as high as it ought to be, but it's getting there. And of course the regime itself has been our biggest advocate, and by pursuing the policies that they're pursuing with increasing blatancy, they are advertising the fact that they are an abusive, undemocratic, dictatorial regime. So that stage of the organization seems to have been very successful. People are aware of the abuses there, but where we seem to have failed is in changing Western policy, in affecting the decision makers. The Western governments are bending over backwards to justify their support of the current regime. And still, despite, for example, the European passed a resolution criticizing the Ethiopian government for, this is the European Parliament rather, criticizing the Ethiopian government for human rights abuses. And yet the European Economic Commission gives more money to Ethiopia than any other country in the world. It gives far, far more than the American government do, for example. It's the European financial support and the American moral support which is keeping that regime going. And they justify it by saying we prefer to remain constructively engaged in order to influence the situation. And if you remember, this was exactly the same justification they gave for maintaining a relationship with the apartheid regime in South Africa.
Absolutely, that's what the Reagan government was doing.
And Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher, yeah, that's true.
But I'm hopeful that, especially with the current changes in the region, that we may see some change within Western policy. We might see some of this rhetoric about human rights and its importance in foreign policy actually being translated into some sort of policy and into, well, practicalities. Yeah.
Yeah. Between Ethiopia and Eritrea is very intriguing and confusing new development in a region already well known for its unpredictability. And it seems that everybody has opinion why it started, and I'm sure you have. You do. So what do you think? What's it all about?
Yeah, obviously we've been thinking about this quite a lot. In terms of its unpredictability, well, like everybody else, I wasn't expecting this to happen. But if you look at what's been happening over the last year or two, the way the Ethiopian administration reacted to the new currency in Eritrea, the insistence on cross-border trade being carried out in hard currency, in dollars, and it should have been predictable.
I know. I mean, at least we who are from that region, we knew for quite a while that there is a problem between the two governments. But I'm sure we never thought that it's going to end up in a...
Well, it was always a marriage of convenience. We knew this, and we knew that the Eritrean resistance movement, the EPLF, was very instructive in helping the regime of the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, taking power in Addis Ababa. I must admit, though, it did take me by surprise when they started attacking each other with such ferocity. There are indications that because of pressure from within the TPLF Central Committee, that Meles Zenawi was forced to deny the Eritreans their part of their share of the cake of Ethiopian resources, which are largely Oromo and other southern peoples' resources. And it seems that the Tigrayans are saying that they can do it all on their own now. They don't need the EPLF anymore, the Eritreans. And so they're trying to marginalize them. And, well, really, if you look at what's happened over the last 2 years, they've been trying to destroy the Eritrean economy.
Yeah, well, that's what they are claiming right now.
There are rumors that about 250 tanks were being delivered to Assab for Ethiopia, and that Isaias Afwerki, the EPLF man, thought these tanks are going to be used against us, so he confiscated them, and that this was possibly a factor in precipitating the conflict. It does seem that despite agreements between those two leaders to iron out this border area at a later stage in favour of Eritrea, despite those agreements, that the Ethiopians set up administrations in those border areas only in the last 6-8 months or so, and it's in response to those that the Eritreans have attacked and pushed the border, put the border back. But I'm seriously concerned that the old nationalist tendencies, which are still alive within the TPLF, are hoping to destroy Eritrean independence and gain access to the sea again.
Yeah. Well, the other issues, about the U.S. government policy, I mean the State Department, and the European governments also, for that matter. Why do you think the these Western governments are promoting these leaders, you know, as a new kind of leaders, new breed of leaders who can bring peace and stability to that region, despite reports after report that there is a gross human rights violation in these countries, and particularly in Ethiopia. And as far as we know, there is no any indication that these leaders are any better than the previous dictators. As you know, recently President Clinton went to Africa. He talked a lot about this new breed of leaders and the African Renaissance.
The new Africans.
He went around and took pictures with these guys. And before his plane even landed, touchdown in Washington, these guys are bombing each other's cities.
Well, that's
why do you think the State Department is following such a misguided policy, and in fact, maybe embarrassing, also very embarrassing policy?
Well, they deserve to be embarrassed. You would have thought that they would have learnt a little bit from Western involvement in Africa over the last 40, 50 years. And backing people like Mobutu and initially Laurent Kabila, now in overthrowing him. Yeah, it would appear that they want to invest in instability in the region. Western foreign policy in Africa has been disastrous since the independence movements of the 50s and 60s. And it's very disappointing to see that regimes like that of Meles Zenawi are getting such support. Like you, I find it amazing that this support continues. It's understood that the Tigrayans and the Eritrean resistance movements were supported by the Americans from the early 80s, from about 84, I think. And it's, I suppose, not too difficult to understand that because of their support of these resistance movements of that time, that they should continue to prop them up when they were in power. But it is remarkable the persistence of this support, despite all the evidence showing that they are propping up a regime which is making the whole region unstable. Now, I've given this some thought because I'm just interested as to why this support should continue. And I presume that big organizations like the State Department are, all the information they receive, that the decision makers receive, has to pass through filters and screens so that the information that actually reaches the decision makers at the top has gone through so many functionaries who are employed only to give the State Department version of events, and so constantly they're justifying what they're doing and why they're doing it, and so any information that gets to the decision makers has to pass through these people who are constantly justifying what the State Department's doing. So it may take a while for the State Department to change course. I liken it to changing the course of the Titanic, which takes a lot of changing, but with similar consequences if we're not careful. The other reasons perhaps are that politicians, like the decision makers in the days of the slave trade, are surrounded by people, their social milieu is such that in the days of the slave trade they were surrounded by people who saw nothing immoral in it, and so they didn't think that it was necessarily bad. And presently decision makers, Western politicians, are surrounded by media moguls or businessmen who don't look at the long-term consequences of what they're doing. Being part of that system, it's necessarily acquisitive and greedy and just looking for short-term profits. And so I suppose if you're surrounded by people like that, you don't think outside of their mindset. But there are intellectuals at the White House, there are intellectuals in the State Department, and it's, well, so-called, yeah. So I'm as perplexed as you are. I'd have thought there were some people of intelligence in the planning departments for Western foreign ministries. Sure, it's baffling.
So what's your plan when you are visiting us? Where are you going, and what are you trying to achieve? And here in Minneapolis, what are you planning to do? Whom are you going to meet? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we're hoping to meet with some local politicians and try and raise awareness within the American political structure, and also organizations. For example, one organization which has been very influential for us is the Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights, yes. And we hope to be meeting with people from there. And then I'll be moving on to Atlanta next week. And again, we'll be hoping to meet with local politicians and media people, and also visiting the Carter Center there.
Oh, okay. I know you have worked with Oromos now for
it's a decade now.
It's a decade, yeah. Yeah. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing Oromos in presenting their case to the international community in general? And since we are in the United States, and maybe some non-Oromos are watching this program because it's in English. What's the challenge you have in presenting our case to the American people?
I think what the message we've got to get over is that the Oromos are not a threat to the other peoples in the region. I think this is what's been responsible for the continued oppression of the Oromo. The Oromo have been sitting on, they are the backbone, really, the economic backbone of Ethiopia, and to a lesser extent some of the other southern peoples there. And any nationalist...
For the benefit of our viewers, if you just tell what the population of Oromo in Ethiopia and what percent of the population they make, maybe.
Well, the population of Ethiopia as a whole is probably somewhere between 55 and 65 million. And estimates of the Oromo population vary between 20 to 30 million. It's around half of the total population of Ethiopia. Okay. The Oromo language, if you ignore imported languages to Africa like Swahili, well, and manufactured language, and Arabic, then the Oromo language is probably second only to Hausa in the whole of Africa in terms of the number of people speaking it. The Oromo people at, say, 25 million are 2.5 times the average population of African countries. The average population of an African country is about 10 million. So there's about 500 million on the continent and about 50 countries. So they're one of the, if not the biggest group, certainly within the north part of Africa. So it's important for people to realize that the Oromo are there, and they are a people, a nation, which has had no recognition in the West prior to, well, the last few years. And I think the reason they've been so oppressed, or one of the reasons, is they sit in the area of the Horn of Africa which is the most productive in terms of mineral and agricultural resources and hydroelectric potential within that region. It doesn't match that of Zaire and Congo, for example. But within that area, the areas where, well, Oromia is the economic backbone of the Horn of Africa, really. And I think people, certainly people who were part of the old political elites in that area, don't like to, they fear Oromo nationalism, because they fear that their resources will be taken away from them. And we've got to correct that misconception. If there was stability in the area, and stability can only occur if region by region people are self-determinate. This doesn't mean secession necessarily, but if you want stability in an area, then the people who live there have to be in control of their resources, they have to be in control of the political structure which runs them, and they have to be in control of the people that are part of that political structure. Now, if we can show the West and the other peoples of that region that this will bring about stability in the area, not instability, it will make the whole of the Horn of Africa will be more stable if there is a representative democracy for the people in Oromia. And if we can demonstrate that this will not threaten the other peoples of the region. The Oromo, unlike some of the other peoples in the area, are not interested in dominating other people. It's not part of their culture. And if we could show that the Oromo mentality and culture is all about sharing, but on an equal basis with other people, then we're quids in. There's no reason why the Horn of Africa shouldn't be a thriving economic community and an example to the whole of the rest of Africa. But this won't occur unless the Oromo basically are self-determinate. And there are advantages to that to everybody in the region.
Of course, it's really quite a large group to be just ignored.
It cannot be ignored. And due to the increasing repression that they've been subject to over the last century, then I'm afraid the feeling amongst Oromo now is getting, there is a danger that it will become more extreme. Yes. And I think if the West continues on its blinkered foreign policy, then scenarios like those that we see in Somalia or that we saw in Rwanda a few years ago are not impossible. And I know this is an awful concept to have, but we ought to face facts. If the West doesn't change its policy in that region, then there is a possibility that that will occur. One of the other reasons for the Oromo being oppressed is that a significant proportion of them, 60, some people say 90%, are Muslim. The West tends to label them as all these, you've got to watch Islam, especially with Sudan being next door with that terrible regime there. If people could only realize that moderate Islam is the best bulwark against militant Islam. It isn't belligerent Christianity. That just produces more militancy amongst Islam. And we saw this with the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yeah. They were ignored by the West, and then you had groups like Hamas coming in. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, despite the apparent lack of ability of the Oromo to develop any militant Islam tendency. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility that if the Oromo continue to be ignored and oppressed, then disaffected Oromo youth may turn to militant Islam. I hope, for God's sake, they don't. But that is another disquieting possibility. So there are several reasons for taking the Oromo seriously and listening to what they have to say and giving them space to look after their own.
Okay. I think that's all the time we have, and it's really a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Commander. It's lovely to be back.
Thanks very much for coming.
Pleasure.
And I hope we'll do this some more time again.
Well, I dare say I'll be back sometime.
Okay. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you. Daawwattoota keenya amma gara dhuma sagantaa keenyarraa dhiyaanneerra. Waa'ee sagantaa kanaa yaada yoo qabaattan akkasumas immoo keessatti qooda fudhachuudhaaf teessoo kanatti aanuun nu qunnamaa. Waan daawwattaniif guddaa isin galateeffachaa sagantaa biraatiin ammoo liddachaa nutti nagaattin isiniin jedha.